Your blood isn't even real family, my daughter-in-law hissed before everyone. They ordered a DNA test to humiliate me. The envelope opened, and the silence fell on her boy. My son's hands trembled. The lawyer leaned forward and said, "There's more, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. From the moment my world crumbled at what should have been the happiest celebration of my life. The dining room was perfect that evening. I'd spent 3 days preparing for our 40th wedding anniversary celebration. Even though my dear Harold had passed away 2 years ago, I wanted to honor his memory, to bring the family together the way he would have loved. The table was set with my grandmother's china. The good silverware gleamed under the chandelier, and the smell of Harold's favorite pot roast filled the house. My son Brian arrived first with his wife Jessica and their twin daughters, Emma and Sophie. At 8 years old, the girls still ran to hug me, their little arms wrapping around my waist with pure love. Behind them walked Jessica, stunning as always in her designer dress, her blonde hair perfectly styled. She kissed my cheek with that practiced smile I'd learned to read over the years. "The house looks lovely, Carol."
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching,
she said, her eyes already scanning the room with a calculating look I pretended not to notice. Brian hugged me tight, and for a moment, I felt that familiar warmth of being loved by my son. At 42, he still had his father's gentle eyes and kind smile. "Thanks for doing this, Mom. Dad would have loved seeing everyone together." My sister Ruth arrived with her husband Frank, followed by my nephew David and his family. Soon the house was filled with conversation, laughter, and the sounds of children playing. I moved between the kitchen and dining room, making sure everyone had drinks, checking on the roast, feeling useful and needed. It was during dessert that everything changed. I was serving Harold's favorite apple pie when Jessica suddenly stood up, her wine glass in hand. Everyone turned to look at her, expecting perhaps a toast to Harold's memory. Instead, what came out of her mouth was like a knife to my heart. "I think it's time we address the elephant in the room," she began, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet dining room. "I've been doing some family research, and there are some inconsistencies that need to be cleared up." Brian frowned. "Jessica, what are you talking about?" She turned her cold blue eyes on me. "I'm talking about your mother, Brian, about whether she actually belongs in this family at all." The silence that followed was deafening. I felt my face flush hot, my hands trembling as I set down the pie server. "I don't understand what you mean, Jessica." "Oh, I think you do." Her voice was sweet as poison. "I've been looking at old family photos, comparing features, doing research. Carol, you look nothing like your supposed sister Ruth, nothing like your parents in the few photos I've seen. It's almost like you don't share any DNA with this family at all," Ruth gasped. "Jessica, that's ridiculous. Carol is my sister. We grew up together." "Did you?" Jessica's smile was sharp. "Or did you just accept what you were told? Because I think there's been a lie at the heart of this family for over 60 years. I felt like I was drowning. The room seemed to spin around me as 20 pairs of eyes stared at me with varying degrees of shock, confusion, and in some cases, suspicious interest. My own son was looking at me like he'd never seen me before. "This is insane," I managed to whisper. "I don't know what you're implying, but I'm not implying anything," Jessica cut me off. "I'm stating it clearly. I don't think you're really part of this family. I think you've been living a lie, and frankly, it affects all of us. It affects inheritance, family property, everything." The word inheritance hung in the air like smoke. Now I understood. This wasn't about family truth or honesty. This was about money, about the house Harold had left me, about the life insurance, about the small but comfortable nest egg we'd built together over 4 decades of marriage. Brian finally found his voice, but it wasn't to defend me. "Mom, is there something you haven't told us?" The betrayal in that question nearly brought me to my knees. My own son, the boy I'd raised, loved, sacrificed for, was asking me if I'd been lying to him his entire life. "Brian, I am your mother. I raised you. I love you. I don't know what Jessica is trying to prove here, but..." "Prove?" Jessica laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "It's simple enough to prove, isn't it? A DNA test. If you're really family, if you really belong here, then you won't mind taking a test to settle this once and for all." I looked around the table at faces I'd known and loved for decades. My sister Ruth looked stricken, torn between defending me and the doubt Jessica had planted. My nephew David was studying his plate, Even the children had stopped playing and were watching the adults with wide, frightened eyes. "I shouldn't have to prove my place in my own family," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "But you will," Jessica said, sitting back down with satisfaction, "because if you refuse, everyone will know you have something to hide, and Brian deserves to know the truth about who his mother really is." Brian was quiet for a long moment, running his hands through his hair the way he had since he was a little boy when he was upset. When he finally looked at me, I saw something in his eyes that broke my heart. Doubt. Maybe it would be good to clear this up, he said quietly, just to put the questions to rest. I stared at my son, this man I'd given birth to, nursed through countless illnesses, cheered at every milestone, supported through every difficulty. He was asking me to prove I deserved his love. "Fine," I said, my voice barely audible. "If that's what it takes." Jessica's smile was triumphant. "Wonderful. I'll arrange everything. We should have results within a week." The rest of the evening passed in a haze of awkward small talk and early departures. People couldn't meet my eyes. Even Ruth seemed uncertain, and that hurt almost as much as Brian's betrayal. As I cleaned up the dishes from what should have been a celebration of love and memory, I felt utterly alone in the world. That night, I sat in Harold's chair in the living room, surrounded by 40 years of family photos, pictures of Brian as a baby, his first steps, first day of school, graduation, wedding, pictures of family vacations, holidays, ordinary moments that had seemed so precious. Now Jessica had poisoned all of it with her accusations. I picked up a photo of Harold and me on our wedding day. We looked so young, so hopeful. I remembered how nervous I'd been, how he'd whispered, "I love you," just before we said our vows. He'd never once questioned who I was or whether I belonged. To him, I was simply Carol, the woman he loved. But now, even that certainty felt shaken, because deep in my heart, in a place I'd never allowed myself to examine too closely, Jessica's words had touched on something I'd always felt but never understood. A sense of not quite fitting, of being somehow different from Ruth and my parents. Little things I'd dismissed over the years suddenly seemed significant. As I finally went to bed that night, I found myself wondering for the first time in my life, who was I really? And what would happen when we found out? The DNA kit arrived 3 days later, delivered by Jessica personally with that same triumphant smile. As I swabbed my cheek and sealed the sample, I felt like I was sealing my own fate. The 2 weeks waiting for the DNA results were the longest of my life. Jessica had made sure everyone knew about the test, framing it as a necessary step to protect the family's integrity. What she was really doing was destroying mine. It started with the phone calls that stopped coming. My weekly coffee date with my neighbor Helen was suddenly canceled. The book club I'd been part of for 15 years? Taking a break for the summer, they said, though it was only April. Even my own sister Ruth seemed awkward and distant when I called. "Carol, I just think we should wait and see what the test says," she told me during one painful conversation. I remember you as my sister, but Jessica raised some valid points about the photos, and I hung up on her. My own sister was questioning our childhood together because my daughter-in-law had planted seeds of doubt. The worst part was Brian, my son, who used to call me twice a week just to chat, suddenly became too busy to talk. When I tried calling him at work, his secretary said he was in meetings. When I called his cell, it went straight to voicemail. The few times he did answer, our conversations were stilted and brief. "How are the girls?" I'd ask about my granddaughters. "They're fine, Mom. Listen, I'm really busy right now. Can we talk later?" Later never came. Jessica, meanwhile, was busy playing the concerned daughter-in-law. She posted on social media about family discoveries and protecting loved ones from difficult truths. She never mentioned me by name, but everyone in our small town knew what she was talking about. I could feel the stares when I went to the grocery store, the whispered conversations that stopped when I walked by. One afternoon, I ran into Jessica at the pharmacy. She was with her friend Melissa, another perfectly put-together suburban mom who'd always treated me politely before. This time, they both looked at me like I was a stranger. "Carol," Jessica said with fake sweetness, "how are you holding up during this difficult time?" "I'm fine," I replied, my voice steady despite the humiliation burning in my chest. "I'm sure you are. It must be so hard not knowing who you really are. But don't worry, we'll have answers soon." She turned to Melissa. Carol's taking a DNA test to confirm her place in our family. It's really for the best, don't you think? Melissa nodded sympathetically, but I could see the gossip already forming in her eyes. By tomorrow, half the town would know that Brian Henderson's mother was so questionable that she needed a DNA test to prove she belonged in her own family. I left the pharmacy without getting my prescription, my hands shaking too badly to hand over my insurance card. That evening, I sat in my kitchen staring at the stack of mail that had accumulated. Bills, mostly, and a few sympathy cards that people were still sending 2 years after Harold's death. At the bottom was a manila envelope from the law office of Peterson and Associates, Harold's old lawyer. Inside was a letter that made my blood run cold. Dear Mrs. Henderson, it has come to our attention that questions have been raised regarding your family relationships. While we cannot discuss the specific contents of your late husband's will without proper legal standing, we felt it necessary to inform you that certain parties have made inquiries about potential challenges to the estate. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to discuss these matters. Sincerely, Robert Peterson, Esky. I read the letter 3 times before it sank in. Jessica wasn't just trying to humiliate me. She was planning to challenge Harold's will. If she could prove I wasn't really part of the family, she might be able to claim that Harold's decision to leave everything to me was based on fraudulent premises. The house, Harold's life insurance, our savings account, even his pension benefits. Everything I thought was secure could be taken away if Jessica succeeded in her campaign. I poured myself a glass of wine with trembling hands and tried to think, what did I actually know about my early childhood? My parents, Margaret and William Carter, had died when I was in college. I'd been born in 1962 at St. Mary's Hospital, or so I'd always been told. Ruth was 3 years older, and she'd always been protective of me growing up. But as I sat there in the growing darkness, memories began surfacing that I'd never paid attention to before. How different I looked from Ruth and our parents. How I'd always felt like an outsider, even in my own family. How my mother sometimes looked at me with an expression I could never quite understand. And then there was the box. I'd found it in the attic after my parents died, filled with old documents and photos. Most of it was routine: birth certificates, report cards, medical records. But there had been some papers I didn't understand at the time, legal documents that mentioned St. Mary's Hospital and something about placement procedures. I'd assumed they were just old insurance papers and had stored the box in my own attic. Now, with Jessica's accusations echoing in my mind, those mysterious papers took on a different meaning. I climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, using my phone's flashlight to navigate through boxes of Christmas decorations and old furniture. The box I was looking for was in the back corner, labeled Parents' Documents in my own handwriting from 20 years ago. My heart pounded as I carried it downstairs and spread the contents across my dining room table. Birth certificates for Ruth and me, report cards, vaccination records, all the paperwork of a normal childhood. But there, at the bottom, were the documents that had puzzled me decades ago. A letter from St. Mary's Hospital dated September 1962, addressed to my parents. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Carter, we want to thank you again for your patience during this difficult time. The administrative error that occurred during the births on September 15th has been resolved to the best of our ability. As discussed, both families have agreed to the current arrangements, and all legal documentation has been properly filed. We sincerely apologize for any confusion this may have caused and appreciate your understanding in this sensitive matter. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper. September 15th, 1962, my birthday. Administrative error, both families, current arrangements. I sank into a chair as the implications hit me. There had been some kind of mix-up at the hospital when I was born. The letter was vague, but it suggested that more than one family had been affected, that arrangements had been made. What if Jessica was right? What if I really wasn't who I thought I was? But even as that terrifying thought formed, another realization followed. If there had been a mistake at the hospital, if I had been placed with the wrong family, that meant somewhere out there might be my real family, people who were actually related to me by blood. The irony was devastating. Jessica was trying to prove I didn't belong with the Carters and Hendersons. But if she succeeded, she might be proving that I belonged somewhere else entirely. Somewhere I'd never known existed. I spent the rest of the night staring at that letter, trying to make sense of it. By morning, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to wait passively for Jessica to destroy my life. I was going to find out the truth for myself. And when I did, Jessica Henderson was going to regret the day she decided to question who I really was. The next morning, I drove to St. Mary's Hospital for the first time since I was born there 61 years ago. The building had been renovated several times, but the original brick facade remained the same. Standing in the parking lot, I felt like I was about to uncover either my salvation or my complete destruction. The records department was on the third floor, staffed by a kind-looking woman in her 50s named Patricia. When I explained what I was looking for, her expression grew cautious. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Henderson, but birth records from 1962 are confidential. We can only release them to the person named on the certificate or immediate family members with proper documentation." "I am the person named on the certificate," I said, sliding my driver's license across the counter. "I just need to verify some information about my birth." So Patricia studied my ID carefully, then typed something into her computer. After a few minutes, she frowned. "That's odd. There seems to be some kind of notation on your file. Can you wait here for a moment? I need to speak with my supervisor." She disappeared into a back office, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts. A notation on my file. That couldn't be good. When Patricia returned, she was accompanied by an older man in a suit who introduced himself as Thomas Morrison, the hospital administrator. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Your birth records are part of a sealed file that requires special authorization to access. This typically happens when there were complications during the birth process." "What kind of complications?" He exchanged a look with Patricia. "I'm not at liberty to discuss the details without proper legal documentation. However, I can tell you that in 1962, there was an incident at this hospital that affected 2 families. If you believe you may have been involved in that incident, I'd recommend contacting an attorney who specializes in hospital records." My heart sank. Even the hospital was treating my birth like some kind of legal problem that required lawyers to solve. "Can you at least tell me who the other family was?" I asked desperately. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Henderson. I really can't say anything more." I left the hospital feeling more confused than ever, but I wasn't giving up. If the hospital wouldn't help me, I'd find another way. My next stop was the town's historical society, housed in a converted Victorian mansion downtown. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Whitman, had been working there for decades and knew everyone in town and their family histories. "Carol Carter Henderson," she mused when I introduced myself. "Yes, I remember your parents. Nice people. Margaret was very involved in the church auxiliary, and you had a sister Ruth, didn't you?" "Yes, that's right, Mrs. Whitman. I'm trying to research some family history, and I was wondering if you might have any records from 1962 about births at St. Mary's Hospital." Her eyes sharpened with interest. "That's very specific. Any particular reason you're interested in that year?" I decided to be honest. "There may have been some kind of administrative issue when I was born. I'm trying to understand what happened." Mrs. Whitman was quiet for a moment, studying my face. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. "You know, you've always reminded me of someone, but I could never put my finger on it. Now that you mention 1962, She trailed off, then suddenly stood up. "Wait here." She disappeared into the archives, leaving me alone in the musty-smelling research room surrounded by old photographs and newspaper clippings. When she returned, she was carrying a thick folder. "September 1962, she said, spreading out old newspaper clippings on the table. There was quite a bit of excitement at the hospital that month. 2 prominent families in town both had babies on the same day, September 15th. The Carters, that's your parents, and the Ashfords. The Ashfords. I knew that name. They were one of the wealthiest families in town. Old money that went back generations. Richard Ashford had owned the largest manufacturing company in the county before he died in the 1990s. The Ashfords had a daughter that day, too, Mrs. Whitman continued. But there was some kind of tragedy. The baby died shortly after birth, I believe. Very sad. They never had any other children. I stared at the newspaper clipping from September 16, 1962. 2 birth announcements side by side. Mr. and Mrs. William Carter are pleased to announce the birth of their daughter, Carol Margaret, born September 15th at St. Mary's Hospital. Mr. and Mrs. Richard Ashford announced with heavy hearts the passing of their infant daughter, Elizabeth Rose, born September 15th at St. Mary's Hospital. "Mrs. Whitman," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "what happened to the Ashfords after they lost their baby?" "Oh, it was very sad. Victoria Ashford never recovered from the loss. She became quite reclusive. Richard threw himself into his business, built it into an empire, really. They moved to the big house on Elm Street and rarely socialized after that. Are they still alive? Victoria died about 10 years ago, but Richard's sister, Eleanor Ashford-Morrison, is still around. She's in her 80s now, lives in that big Victorian house on Maple Street, never married, devoted her life to taking care of Richard after Victoria died. Eleanor Ashford-Morrison, the woman who might hold the answers to questions I was only beginning to understand. That afternoon, I found myself standing on the porch of a magnificent Victorian house, my hand poised to knock on the door. The house was immaculate, painted in shades of blue and white with intricate gingerbread trim. It was the kind of house that spoke of old money and carefully maintained traditions. An elderly woman answered the door, and I immediately saw why Mrs. Whitman thought I reminded her of someone. Eleanor Ashford-Morrison had the same green eyes I saw in the mirror every day, the same stubborn chin, the same delicate bone structure that had always made me feel different from Ruth and my parents. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cultured and cautious. "Miss Morrison, my name is Carol Henderson. I was born Carol Carter on September 15th, 1962 at St. Mary's Hospital. I believe there may have been some confusion that day, and I was hoping you might be able to help me understand what happened." The color drained from her face. She gripped the door frame so tightly her knuckles turned white. "September 15th, she whispered. "Oh my God, Elizabeth!" The name hit me like a physical blow. Elizabeth Rose Ashford, the baby who had supposedly died on the day I was born. "May I come in?" I asked gently. "I think we need to talk." Eleanor nodded wordlessly and stepped aside. As I followed her into a living room filled with antiques and family portraits, I caught sight of myself in an ornate mirror. For the first time in my life, I looked like I belonged somewhere. Eleanor settled into a chair across from me, her hands trembling as she studied my face. "I knew this day would come eventually," she said. "Richard always said it would, but Victoria made us promise to never look for you." "Look for me?" "Elizabeth," she said, and the name sounded like a prayer. "Our Elizabeth didn't die that day. There was a terrible mix-up at the hospital. 2 babies born at almost the same time, both blonde girls with similar weights. The night nurse made a mistake with the identification bracelets. I felt the room spinning around me. What are you saying? By the time they realized what had happened, both families had already bonded with the babies they'd been given. The hospital administrators were terrified of the legal implications. They convinced both families to keep the children they had, to never speak of what had happened. But why? Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. The Carters were good people, but they were struggling financially. Your father, William, worked at Richard's factory. If the truth had come out, there would have been lawsuits, investigations, media attention. The hospital's insurance would have been ruined, and Margaret Carter was so in love with you already. She'd lost 2 babies before you came along, so you just let them keep me? Victoria couldn't bear the thought of taking you away from a mother who had already lost so much. She was devastated about losing you, but she convinced herself it was God's will, that you belonged with people who would love you desperately because they'd almost lost hope of having a child. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what I was hearing. The woman I'd called mother my entire life wasn't my biological mother, but she had loved me fiercely, protectively, completely. Richard wanted to fight for you, Eleanor continued. He hired lawyers, demanded investigations, but Victoria begged him to let it go. She said if you were meant to be with us, fate wouldn't have allowed the mistake to happen. What about the other baby, the one you raised? Eleanor's face crumpled. There was no other baby, Elizabeth. The child who died that day was a stillborn baby from another family entirely. 3 babies were involved in the mix-up, not 2. 1 lived with the Carters. You. 1 died, the infant who should have gone to a family in the next county. And 1 went missing from the records entirely. Missing? The hospital covered up the entire incident. Records were altered, death certificates were filed incorrectly, and families were paid substantial sums to stay quiet. Victoria and Richard received a settlement that helped build the family business, but they never had another child. They spent 60 years grieving for you. I felt tears streaming down my face. Why didn't they ever try to contact me? They did, in their way. Richard established a trust fund in your name, Elizabeth Rose Ashford, when you turned 18. When you got married and became Henderson, he updated it. When you had Brian, he added provisions for his education. Every milestone in your life, he celebrated privately. A trust fund? Eleanor stood up and walked to an antique secretary desk in the corner. She returned with a thick folder. Richard died 5 years ago. In his will, he left instructions that if you ever came looking for answers, I was to give you this. Inside the folder were dozens of photographs taken from a distance. Me graduating from high school, my wedding to Harold, Brian's birth, birthday parties, holidays, ordinary moments of my life captured by someone who loved me from afar. At the bottom of the folder was a legal document that made my hands shake. A trust fund worth over $2 million, established in the name of Elizabeth Rose Ashford Henderson, to be released upon proof of identity, or in the event that questions arose about my parentage. Jessica doesn't know about any of this, I said, more to myself than to Eleanor. Who's Jessica? My daughter-in-law. She's the one who demanded the DNA test. She thinks proving I'm not related to my family will somehow benefit her. Eleanor smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. Oh, my dear, she has no idea what she's about to unleash, does she? The DNA results arrived on a Thursday morning, exactly 2 weeks after I'd submitted my sample. Jessica had arranged for the entire family to gather at Brian's house that evening to hear the results together. She called it bringing closure to this difficult situation. I called it a public execution, but now I knew something Jessica didn't. I wasn't just Carol Carter Henderson, the woman whose family legitimacy she was trying to destroy. I was Elizabeth Rose Ashford, heir to a fortune and a family legacy that dwarfed anything the Carters or Hendersons had ever possessed. Eleanor had spent the past week helping me understand my true heritage. The Ashfords were one of the founding families of our town, with roots dating back to the 1800s. Richard's manufacturing company had employed half the county for decades. Their philanthropic foundation had built the library, funded the hospital's expansion, and provided scholarships for hundreds of local students. Your father was a remarkable man, Eleanor had told me as we sat in her living room, surrounded by family portraits where I could finally see my own features reflected. He never stopped hoping that someday you'd come home. Now, as I drove to Brian's house with the sealed envelope containing my DNA results, I felt strangely calm. Jessica thought she was about to humiliate me in front of my family. Instead, she was about to hand me the keys to a life I'd never known existed. Brian's house was already full when I arrived. Ruth was there with Frank, looking anxious and guilty. My nephew David sat uncomfortably on the couch with his wife. Even some of Harold's relatives had come, drawn by the promise of family drama. Jessica moved among them like a hostess at a party, playing the role of the concerned daughter-in-law protecting her family from an imposter. "Carol," she said when she saw me, her smile sharp as a blade. "Thank you for coming. I know this must be difficult for you." Brian avoided my eyes as he gestured for me to sit down. The distance between us felt like an ocean. These past 2 weeks had shown me exactly what my son was made of, and it wasn't the strong moral fiber I'd thought I'd instilled in him. "Before we open the results," Jessica announced to the room, "I want everyone to understand why this was necessary. Family integrity matters. Inheritance matters. We all deserve to know the truth about our bloodlines." She was standing next to the mantelpiece where my wedding photo with Harold sat alongside pictures of Brian and the twins. Soon, I thought, those photos might be the only evidence that I'd ever been part of this family. "Carol," Jessica continued, turning to me with false sympathy, "do you have anything you'd like to say before we reveal whether you're really part of this family?" I looked around the room at faces I'd known and loved for decades. Some looked curious, others uncomfortable, a few openly skeptical. My own sister wouldn't meet my eyes. "Actually, I do have something to say," I replied, standing up. "But first, let's see those results." Jessica's smile widened as she tore open the envelope. She pulled out the official document and began reading aloud. "DNA analysis shows that Carol Carter Henderson shares no significant genetic markers with the Carter family line. The probability of biological relationship is less than 0, EU 1%. Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Ruth covered her mouth with her hands. Brian's face went white as he stared at me like I was a stranger. Furthermore, Jessica continued, her voice triumphant, the analysis indicates strong genetic markers consistent with Northern European ancestry, specifically matching profiles common in the British Isles and... She stopped reading. I watched her face change as she scanned the rest of the document. "What does it say, Jessica?" Brian asked when she remained silent. She looked up at me, confusion replacing her earlier confidence. It says Carol's DNA shows markers indicating she may be related to other families in our database. It recommends further testing to identify potential biological relatives. How interesting, I said calmly. Because I've already done that further testing. The room fell silent. Jessica's hand holding the results began to tremble. What do you mean? Brian asked. I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder Eleanor had prepared for me. I mean, I know exactly who I am, Brian. And it's not who any of us thought. I opened the folder and pulled out the first document. My name is Elizabeth Rose Ashford-Henderson. I was born on September 15, 1962. At St. Mary's Hospital, where a terrible mistake changed the course of 3 families' lives. Jessica's face had gone completely white. That's impossible, is it? Let me tell you what really happened. I pulled out the hospital letter I'd found in my parents' papers. There was a mix-up in the nursery that night. 3 babies were affected. 1 died, 1 went home with the wrong family, and 1 went home with a family who knew she wasn't biologically theirs but loved her anyway. Ruth suddenly spoke up, her voice shaking. I remember now. Mom and Dad were so secretive about the hospital stay. They wouldn't let me visit, and they acted so strange when they brought you home. Because they knew, I continued. The Carters were told about the mistake and given a choice. They could give me back to my biological family, the Ashfords, or they could keep me and never speak of what had happened. They chose love over blood. Brian was staring at me in shock. The Ashfords? As in Richard Ashford? My biological father. The man who owned the factory where William Carter worked. The man who could have destroyed the Carters' lives but chose not to, because his wife couldn't bear the thought of taking me away from parents who had already lost 2 babies. I pulled out the trust fund documents. Richard Ashford never stopped being my father, even from a distance. He established a trust fund for his daughter Elizabeth Rose that's now worth over $2 million. He updated my name and information every time my life changed, waiting for the day I might need to know the truth. The silence in the room was deafening. Jessica was staring at the documents like they might burst into flames. There's more, I continued, enjoying the shocked expressions around me. Richard Ashford left specific instructions in his will. If questions were ever raised about my parentage, his sister Eleanor was authorized to provide me with full documentation of my heritage and immediate access to my inheritance. I turned to look directly at Jessica. So thank you, Jessica. By demanding that DNA test, you've given me the greatest gift imaginable. You've given me back my true identity and a family fortune I never knew existed. Jessica found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. This can't be real. Oh, it's very real. I've spent the past week with Eleanor Ashford-Morrison, learning about the family I never knew, looking at photographs of grandparents and great-grandparents who share my eyes, my smile, my stubborn chin, understanding why I never quite fit with the Carters, despite their incredible love for me. Brian stood up abruptly. Mom, why didn't you tell us any of this? Because I didn't know, Brian. I lived my entire life believing I was Carol Carter. It wasn't until Jessica forced me to question my identity that I discovered the truth. Ruth was crying now. Carol, I'm so sorry. I should have defended you. I should have trusted my own memories. It's all right, Ruth. You're still my sister in every way that matters. Margaret and William Carter were still my parents. They raised me, loved me, shaped who I became. Blood doesn't erase that. Jessica had been scanning the trust fund documents, her face growing paler with each page. This says the trust includes property holdings, stock portfolios, and... She looked up at me with growing horror and controlling interest in Ashford Manufacturing, which is now Henderson Manufacturing, I corrected. I believe it was renamed when Richard's will was executed 5 years ago, in anticipation of my eventual inheritance. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Henderson Manufacturing was one of the largest employers in the county, a multi-million-dollar corporation that Brian's own engineering firm had done contract work for. So let me make sure I understand this correctly, I said, addressing the room but looking directly at Jessica. You demanded a DNA test to prove I didn't belong in this family, hoping to challenge Harold's will and claim his modest estate for yourselves. Instead, you've proven that I'm the heir to a fortune worth millions and a family legacy that spans generations. Jessica's carefully constructed world was collapsing around her. But the inheritance from Harold is still mine, I said firmly. Harold married Carol Carter Henderson, and I am Carol Carter Henderson, regardless of my biological parentage. His will stands exactly as he wrote it. Brian finally found his voice again. Mom, I don't understand. If you're really an Ashford, why were you living so modestly? Why were you and Dad struggling with money when I was growing up? Because I didn't know, sweetheart. Richard Ashford watched me from a distance my entire life, but he honored his wife's wishes never to interfere. The trust fund was set up to activate only if I learned the truth or if my parentage was questioned. I pulled out the final document Eleanor had given me, which brings me to the other part of Richard's will. He left specific instructions about what should happen if anyone ever tried to use my unknown heritage against me. Jessica had gone very still. What kind of instructions? He established a legal fund to protect his daughter from exactly this situation. Anyone who attempts to exploit, manipulate, or harm Elizabeth Rose Ashford financially or emotionally will face the full resources of the Ashford family legal team. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Jessica had spent 2 weeks destroying my reputation and relationships, thinking she was attacking a helpless widow. Instead, she'd been attacking the daughter of one of the most powerful families in the state. I said, gathering my documents. This has been quite enough drama for one evening. As I walked toward the door, Brian called after me. Mom, wait, what happens now? I turned back to look at my son, this man I'd raised and loved who had stood by while his wife tried to destroy me. Now, Brian, you have some decisions to make about what kind of man you want to be, about what kind of family you want to have, and about whether you can live with yourself for letting this happen. I walked out of that house, feeling like I was walking out of one life and into another. Behind me, I could hear Jessica's voice rising in panic as the full implications of what she'd unleashed began to sink in. Tomorrow, I would meet with the Ashford family lawyers. I would learn about business holdings and investment portfolios. I would step into a role I'd never imagined and a legacy I'd never known existed. But tonight, I was simply Carol Henderson, driving home through familiar streets, finally understanding why I'd always felt like I was searching for something I couldn't name. I'd found it, and Jessica Henderson was going to spend the rest of her life regretting that she'd helped me find it. The call came at 6 a.m, 3 days after the DNA revelation. I was sitting on Eleanor's back porch, drinking coffee and watching the sunrise over gardens that had been in my biological family for generations. The caller ID showed Brian's number. Mom. His voice was strained, exhausted. We need to talk. Do we? I asked, surprised by how calm I felt. Because for the past 3 days, you haven't seemed interested in talking to me. Jessica's been. She's not handling this well. She's barely slept, barely eaten. She keeps saying this is all some kind of elaborate fraud. I almost laughed. A fraud? Brian, you saw the DNA results. You saw the trust fund documents. Eleanor has photo albums dating back 60 years showing Richard Ashford watching me from a distance. What part of this seems fraudulent to you? It's not that. It's just, this changes everything. Yes, it does. The question is, how are you going to handle that change? There was a long pause. Can you come over? Jessica wants to apologize. Now I did laugh, a sound with no humor in it. Jessica wants to apologize? After 2 weeks of publicly humiliating me, isolating me from my friends, and trying to steal my inheritance? After making me question my entire identity and my place in my own family? Mom, please. She made a mistake. She made a choice, Brian. She chose to be cruel, calculating, and greedy. She chose to attack me when she thought I was vulnerable and defenseless. The only thing she's sorry about is that her plan backfired, but curiosity won out over my anger. I wanted to see Jessica try to talk her way out of the hole she'd dug. Fine, I'll be there in an hour. Eleanor looked up from her morning newspaper as I gathered my purse. Are you sure about this, dear? I need to see it through, I told her. I need to understand what kind of people I raised my son to value. Be careful. Desperate people do desperate things. Brian's house felt different when I walked through the front door. The carefully curated perfection was still there, but it felt hollow now, like a stage set waiting for actors who might never return. Jessica was in the living room, and I was shocked by her appearance. She looked like she'd aged years in 3 days. Her perfect hair was unkempt, her usually flawless makeup absent, her designer clothes wrinkled. "Carol," she said, standing up uncertainly, "thank you for coming." "It's Elizabeth," I corrected quietly, "or Mrs. Henderson if you prefer formality." She flinched. "I owe you an apology." "Do you? For what specifically?" Brian shifted uncomfortably between us. I could see he'd been hoping for some kind of tearful reconciliation, but I wasn't in the mood to make this easy for anyone. "For questioning your place in the family," Jessica said, the words sounding rehearsed. "For making you take the DNA test. For everything. You're apologizing for questioning my place in the family?" I sat down in Harold's old chair, the one Jessica had tried to convince Brian to get rid of last year. "Let me ask you something, Jessica. If that DNA test had shown what you expected it to show, if it had proven I wasn't related to the Carters, what would you have done then?" She didn't answer. "You would have challenged Harold's will," I continued. "You would have tried to take this house, his life insurance, everything he left me. You would have destroyed a 60-year-old woman financially and emotionally, and you would have felt justified doing it. Isn't that right? That's not. I never intended." "You intended exactly that. You saw what you thought was an opportunity to get rid of me and claim what you thought should be yours. The only thing you're sorry about is that it didn't work." Brian finally spoke up. "Mom, she's trying to apologize. Can't we move past this?" I looked at my son, really looked at him. Move past it. "Brian, do you understand what your wife tried to do to me? She didn't just question my DNA. She isolated me from my friends, made me a subject of gossip in my own town, convinced my own sister to doubt our childhood together. She made me feel like a stranger in my own life. But it worked out," he said weakly. "You found out about your real family, about the money. It worked out." I stood up, anger finally breaking through my calm facade. "Brian, your wife spent 2 weeks systematically destroying my reputation and my relationships because she thought she could profit from it. The fact that her cruelty accidentally led to something positive doesn't make what she did acceptable." Jessica was crying now, but they looked like tears of frustration rather than remorse. "I just wanted what was best for our family." "No, you wanted what was best for yourself, and when you couldn't get it legitimately, you decided to tear down an old woman to take it." "I'm not the only one who had questions," Jessica snapped, her mask slipping. "Everyone in this family has wondered about you, how different you look from Ruth, how you never quite fit in. I just had the courage to ask the questions everyone else was thinking." There it was, the real Jessica, finally emerging from behind the false apologies. "The courage?" I repeated. "Is that what you call it? Courage?" "Yes, someone had to protect this family's integrity." "From what? From me? From the woman who raised your husband, who babysat your children, who welcomed you into her family with open arms, from someone who was taking what didn't belong to her." The honesty was stunning in its cruelty. Even now, even knowing what she'd unleashed, Jessica couldn't admit that what she'd done was wrong. "You're right about one thing," I said finally. "Someone did need to protect this family's integrity, but not from me, from you." I turned to Brian. "Your wife just told us exactly who she is. She's someone who would destroy an elderly woman to get what she wants. She's someone who sees family relationships as obstacles to overcome rather than bonds to cherish. Is that really the kind of person you want raising your daughters?" "Mom, you're being dramatic." "Am I? Let me tell you what happened while you sat silently and let your wife attack me. I found out I have a biological family who spent 60 years loving me from a distance. I inherited a fortune I never knew existed. I discovered a legacy of philanthropy and community service that I'm now responsible for continuing. I pulled out a document Eleanor's lawyer had prepared. I also discovered that I now own the company that employs half this town, including several businesses that your engineering firm depends on for contracts. Brian's face went white as the implications sank in. So here's what's going to happen, I continued. I'm going to honor my biological father's legacy by using the Ashford fortune responsibly. I'm going to support the community that supported him. I'm going to ensure that good, honest, hardworking people have opportunities to succeed. I looked directly at Jessica. But I'm also going to make sure that people who try to exploit or manipulate others face consequences for their actions. What does that mean? Brian asked. It means that your wife's behavior over the past 2 weeks has been documented by several witnesses. It means that her attempts to challenge Harold's will and manipulate family relationships have been recorded. And it means that the Ashford family legal team now has a very clear picture of exactly what kind of person Jessica Henderson is. Jessica had gone very still. Are you threatening me? I'm informing you. The Ashford family has always protected what's theirs. I'm what's theirs now, and they don't take kindly to people who try to harm family members. But I'm family too, Jessica said desperately. I'm married to your son. You're married to my son. That doesn't make you family. Family doesn't try to destroy each other for personal gain. Family doesn't isolate and humiliate each other. Family doesn't stand by and watch while someone they claim to love is being attacked. I gathered my purse and stood to leave. I've learned a lot about family these past few weeks. I've learned that blood doesn't always determine who belongs together. The Carters weren't my biological family, but they loved me unconditionally. The Ashfords were my biological family, but they loved me enough to let me go when they thought it was best for me. I paused at the door. I've also learned that some people will never understand what family really means. They see relationships as transactions, love as currency, and loyalty as something to be bought and sold. Mom, wait, Brian called after me. What about us? What about Emma and Sophie? I turned back to look at him. That's up to you, Brian. You can continue to be married to someone who would destroy your own mother for money, or you can decide what kind of man you actually want to be. You can teach your daughters that family means protecting each other, or you can teach them that cruelty is acceptable if it's profitable. And if I choose wrong? The question hung in the air between us. I could see in his eyes that he already knew the answer. Then you'll discover that actions have consequences, I said softly, and that sometimes, when you choose the wrong side, you end up losing everything that actually mattered. As I walked away from that house for what I suspected might be the last time, I heard Jessica's voice rising behind me, finally showing her true colors as she screamed at Brian about his ungrateful mother and how this was all so unfair. I drove back to Eleanor's house through streets that looked different now that I understood my place in them. The Ashford name was on buildings, parks, scholarships, and charitable foundations throughout the town. I wasn't just Carol Henderson anymore. I was Elizabeth Rose Ashford-Henderson, daughter of 2 families, heir to 2 different kinds of love, and guardian of a legacy I was only beginning to understand. But I was also a mother whose own son had failed to protect her when she needed him most. And that was a pain that no amount of money or newfound family could heal. Tomorrow, I would begin learning how to be an Ashford. Tonight, I would grieve for the Henderson family I thought I'd known, and decide whether anything could be salvaged from the wreckage Jessica had created. 6 months later, I stood in the boardroom of Henderson Manufacturing, looking out at the faces of department heads and senior managers who had worked for my biological father for decades. Some were older than me, veterans of Richard Ashford's leadership who remembered when the company was half its current size. Others were younger, ambitious professionals who had joined the company in recent years, drawn by its reputation for innovation and employee care. As you all know, I began, this company has always been built on the principle that success should benefit the entire community, not just the shareholders. My father believed that a business has responsibilities beyond profit, and I intend to honor that tradition. I'd spent these past months learning every aspect of the company Richard had built. The manufacturing floors where precision machinery created components for everything from automobiles to medical equipment. The research and development department, where engineers worked on projects that would shape the industry's future. The human resources department that treated employees like family members rather than expendable resources. It was overwhelming and humbling to realize that I was now responsible for over 800 jobs, for the livelihoods of families throughout the county. But Eleanor had been an invaluable guide, helping me understand not just the business operations, but the philosophy behind them. The Ashford Foundation will be expanding its scholarship program, I continued, referencing the notes I'd prepared. We're also implementing a new employee profit-sharing plan and expanding our healthcare benefits to include mental health coverage. After the meeting, I walked through the factory floor with Tom Bradley, the plant manager who had worked alongside Richard for 30 years. He was a kind man in his 60s who had treated me with patience and respect as I learned the ropes. "Your father would be proud," he said as we watched workers assembling components with practiced precision. "You've got his instincts for understanding what people need." "I'm still learning," I admitted. "Some days I feel like I'm pretending to be someone I'm not." "Aren't we all?" Tom smiled. "But you're not pretending to care about people. That's real, and it shows." It was true. Despite the surreal nature of my transformation from retired teacher to manufacturing heiress, I found myself genuinely engaged with the work. The company wasn't just a business to me, it was a community, a legacy, a responsibility that connected me to both the father I'd never known and the workers who depended on leadership that understood their value. My phone buzzed as I returned to my office. A text from Eleanor. "Brian is here to see you. Should I send him up?" I stared at the message for a long moment. I hadn't spoken to my son since that confrontation at his house. He'd tried calling several times in the first month, but I hadn't been ready. Then the calls had stopped, and I'd assumed he'd made his choice about what mattered most to him. "Send him up," I replied. Brian appeared in my office doorway 5 minutes later, looking nervous and uncertain. He'd lost weight, and there were new lines around his eyes that spoke of stress and sleepless nights. "Mom," he said quietly, "you look different." I was wearing a tailored business suit Eleanor had helped me choose, my hair styled professionally, confidence that came from knowing my own worth. "I feel different. Can I sit down?" I gestured to the chairs across from my desk. Strange to think that my son, who had once been my entire world, now felt like a visitor in my life. "I left Jessica," he said without preamble. I kept my expression neutral, though my heart jumped. "When?" 3 months ago. I should have done it sooner. But I kept thinking I could fix things, make her understand what she'd done wrong. He laughed bitterly. "But you can't fix someone who doesn't think they need fixing." "What changed your mind?" "Emma asked me why Grandma Carol didn't visit anymore. When I tried to explain it to her, I realized I couldn't justify what had happened. I couldn't explain to my 8-year-old daughter why I'd let my wife attack her grandmother. I felt tears threatening, but kept them in check. How are the girls handling the separation? Better than I expected. Jessica had become difficult to live with. Everything was about money, about status, about what other people had that she deserved. The girls were walking on eggshells around her. "And you?" "I'm learning to be the father they deserve. The man you raised me to be before I lost my way." He paused, looking directly at me for the first time. "Mom, I'm sorry for everything, for not defending you, for doubting you, for letting my wife treat you like an enemy." The apology I'd waited months to hear, but it felt different now, less urgent than it would have 6 months ago. I'd built a new life, found new purposes, discovered strength I hadn't known I possessed. "I appreciate that, Brian, but sorry doesn't undo the damage. Sorry doesn't erase the nights I lay awake wondering if I'd somehow failed as a mother, if I'd done something to deserve being treated like a stranger in my own family. I know, I can't take back what happened, but I'm hoping we can find a way forward." I studied my son's face, seeing both the man he'd become and echoes of the boy I'd raised. "That depends on what you've learned from this experience." I learned that I'm weaker than I thought I was, that I let someone else's greed and ambition override my own judgment, that I failed to protect the person who mattered most to me. And I learned that family isn't about blood or money or social status. It's about loyalty, respect, and love. Things Jessica never understood, and that I forgot when it mattered most. I was quiet for a long moment, processing his words. "Brian, I've forgiven you. But forgiveness doesn't mean everything goes back to the way it was. I'm not the same person I was 6 months ago. I can see that. You seem stronger, more confident. I am. I've learned that I don't need anyone's approval to know my own worth. I've learned that I can survive betrayal and come out stronger. I've learned that sometimes the people who try to tear you down end up giving you exactly what you need to build something better. Can we try again? Slowly? I looked out the window at the town below, at the community my biological father had served, and that I was now responsible for helping. The girls can visit me at Eleanor's house. You can too if you want. But Brian, I need you to understand something. I'm not going to pretend that what happened didn't happen. I'm not going to minimize it to make you feel better about your choices. I wouldn't ask you to. And if you ever put me in a position where I have to choose between my dignity and your comfort again, I'll choose my dignity every time. He nodded. I understand. Do you? Because for 60 years, I put other people's needs before my own. I made myself smaller to make others comfortable. I accepted disrespect to keep peace. That woman is gone, Brian. I won't be her again for anyone. Good, he said, surprising me. You shouldn't be. The mom I remember was strong and independent. Somewhere along the way, you started dimming your light to avoid making other people feel overshadowed. You don't have to do that anymore. After Brian left, I sat alone in my office as the sun set over the factory floor. Through the windows, I could see workers heading home to their families, carrying lunchboxes and talking with colleagues, their faces tired but satisfied after a day's honest work. This was what Richard Ashford had built, what he'd entrusted to me, not just a business, but a community of people who depended on each other. My phone rang, Eleanor's voice, warm and amused. How did it go with Brian? Better than I expected. He's learning. Are you going to let him back into your life? I considered the question, gradually, carefully, with clear boundaries. And Jessica? I smiled, thinking of my former daughter-in-law who had disappeared from town shortly after Brian filed for divorce. Jessica taught me the most valuable lesson of all, which was that when someone shows you who they really are, you should believe them the first time. She showed me she was someone who would destroy an old woman for money. I believed her, and I acted accordingly. The restraining order was a nice touch. It had been necessary. Jessica had tried several times to contact me after learning about the Ashford fortune, alternately threatening lawsuits and begging for family support. The legal team Eleanor had connected me with had made it clear that any further harassment would result in serious consequences. She made her choices, I said. Now she gets to live with them. That evening, I sat on Eleanor's porch with a cup of tea and the latest financial reports from Henderson Manufacturing. The company was thriving under my leadership, expanding into new markets while maintaining the employee-focused policies Richard had established. The Ashford Foundation had awarded scholarships to 30 local students this year, and we were breaking ground on a new community center next month. Any regrets? Eleanor asked, settling into the chair beside me. I thought about the question seriously. 6 months ago, I'd been Carol Henderson, retired teacher, widow, grandmother. My biggest concerns had been whether my son called often enough and whether I could afford to fix my leaky roof. Now I was Elizabeth Rose Ashford Henderson, business owner, philanthropist, guardian of a legacy that touched hundreds of lives. Only one, I said finally. What's that? I regret that it took Jessica's cruelty to show me who I really was. I wish I'd found my strength some other way. Eleanor smiled. Maybe, but sometimes we need to be broken before we can become who we're meant to be. Your father always said the most beautiful metals were forged in the hottest fires. I thought about that as I watched the stars appear in the darkening sky. Jessica had tried to break me, to reduce me to nothing so she could take what she wanted. Instead, she'd forced me to discover reserves of strength I'd never known I possessed. She'd inadvertently given me a family, a fortune, and a purpose that transformed my life in ways I couldn't have imagined. In trying to prove I didn't belong anywhere, she'd helped me find exactly where I belonged. My phone buzzed with a text from Brian. Emma wants to know if she can visit Grandma this weekend. She misses your chocolate chip cookies. I smiled as I typed back, tell her I'll teach her the secret ingredient if she wants to learn. Some bridges could be rebuilt, carefully and with time. Others were better left burned. The wisdom was in knowing the difference. As I headed inside to prepare for another day of honoring my father's legacy and building my own, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. complete peace with who I was and where I belonged. Jessica had wanted to know about my blood, about my DNA, about my biological right to exist in my own family. She'd gotten her answer, just not the one she'd expected. My blood was Ashford blood, connected to generations of people who had built and served this community. But more than that, I was the product of two kinds of love. The love of biological parents who'd sacrificed their own desires for what they believed was best for their child, and the love of adoptive parents who'd chosen to raise a daughter with no expectation of biological connection. I was exactly who I was supposed to be, exactly where I was supposed to be, and Jessica Henderson, wherever she was now, would spend the rest of her life knowing that her cruelty had been the catalyst for my greatest triumph. Sometimes, the best revenge was simply living well, and I intended to live very well indeed.